I'm Robin Douglas. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this book launch and celebration of Mark Pennington's Foucault and Liberal Political Economy, Power, Knowledge and Freedom. Mark is Professor of Political Economy and Public Policy in the Department of Political Economy here at King's. For those of you who are familiar with his work, this book both brings together and builds on his existing research expertise and also strikes out in a new direction that I think will be a surprise to many of us who are familiar with his earlier work. So the existing research expertise for which Mark is most famous is the work he's done in the past on classical liberal political economy, what in the book he sometimes calls postmodern liberalism. And the tradition he's working out of here comes from the Austrian political economists in the early 20th century, most famously Friedrich von Hayek. And Mark's written extensively on that tradition in the past, most importantly in his 2011 book, Robust Political Economy, where he defends that tradition and thinks about its implications for questions of political economy and public policy today. But in this book, he's drawing on that tradition, and he's also going in a very new direction for him, which is to turn to Foucault and the influence of Foucauldian thinking. I remember first talking to Mark about this a few years ago, and this was a surprise. These are not two things that often go together. No doubt Mark will tell us a bit more about why he decided to. For those of you who are kind of unfamiliar with these traditions, Foucault's own political commitments are notoriously difficult to place, and arguably they change quite a lot over his life. But most of the people who are drawn to Foucault are from the left of the political spectrum. They tend to be very, very critical of capitalism and even markets more generally. Whereas most of the people who draw on, if you like, classical liberal political economy, people like Hayek, tend to be associated more with the right of the political spectrum and tend to defend capitalism and free markets. And actually, one of the things that Mark's book does very well is to show us that this kind of dichotomy, this way of thinking about things, isn't particularly helpful. I think that's one of the kind of indirect implications of his book. But nonetheless, these are still two very different traditions. I don't know whether you like this, Mark, but I think the experience of reading the book is a bit like trying a new kind of experimental fusion cuisine. You sort of think, I'm not sure these things really should go together, but the more you get into it, the more you see actually they do work in a strange sort of way. They really do complement each other in a way you might not expect. So this isn't the way that Mark pitches it, but one way that you could start to think about how the two might come together is to notice that one of the central preoccupations of a great deal of liberal thinking, especially kind of classical liberalism, is the concern about power, a worry about the abuse of power, about the centralization of power. That's a strong theme in a great deal of liberal thought. And one of the criticisms that liberals often get is, well, you think about power too narrowly, right? You think about it purely in political terms, purely in juridical terms. And if we want a more expansive notion of power, well, where better to go than Foucault, the most preeminent theorist of power in the 20th century. So there's one way you might think the two come together here, right? The liberal concern with questions of power, the abuse of power, the centralization of power, and then you turn to Foucault for a more capacious understanding of power. There is, of course, a big difficulty here, and it's one that Mark is well aware of and that he confronts head on. And that is that Foucault's understanding of power might be too capacious. Right? Foucault famously says that power is omnipresent, it's everywhere, there's no escaping power. So once you take that insight seriously, it's difficult to know how you generate normative conclusions from Foucauldian analysis, right? Because what does he give us to evaluate different constellations of power and choose between them? And here, Mark turns in particular to Foucault's late work on the care of self to extract a notion of subjectivity under conditions of power, which, as he shows, shares a striking amount in common with lots of the people from the liberal political economy tradition. And so this is the theoretical framework that Mark constructs, and he goes on to apply it to debates in social justice, public health, environmental sustainability, and law and order. And as these remarks hopefully suggest, this really is a strikingly ambitious and a strikingly original book, Original's a term that gets bounded around a lot, but this is actually a really original book. It's the type of book that you read and you often pause and think, yeah, I hadn't thought about things like that before. Or you stop and think, that can't be true, can it? Maybe it's true, I hope it's not true. But there are many, many moments where when I was reading this book, you do just pause and you do stop and you think about it. And that's what good political theory should do. That's what good PPE should do. So this book is in the new PPE series by Oxford University Press. And I think it's a great example of the attempt to draw on many different disciplines, many different traditions that don't necessarily go together to give a kind of bold new way of thinking about this subject matter. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Mark to talk about the book further.
Thank you so much, Robin, for that wonderful introduction. Before I start, I'd like to thank a number of other people as well. The people who've helped to organise the event this evening. My colleagues, Elena Zhang, who's at the back of the room, and Max Lacour, who's been helping get people into the room. We also have our film crew at the back there, Yolding Media. So I'd like to thank them all for their contribution to this event. So, the key question that motivates this book, which as Robin has already indicated, is as follows. Is Michel Foucault's postmodern social political theory compatible with the principles of liberal political economy? By postmodern, I mean a philosophical stance skeptical of universal truth claims, one skeptical of the relationship between science and government, and one skeptical of the possibility of the fully autonomous individual. By liberal political economy, I mean a social and political theory emphasizing the role of individual agency in influencing personal and social outcomes, and a normative political project that seeks to protect that agency from public and private forms of power. My answer to the question is yes. There is a stream of liberal political economy compatible with Foucauldian or postmodernist concepts. It includes economists such as Friedrich Hayek, Deirdre McCloskey, Ludwig Lachmann, George Shackle, and Don Lavoie. It includes political philosophers ranging from Michael Oakeshott through to Jerry Gauss and to Chandran Kukathas. While none of these thinkers identify themselves as postmodernists or Foucauldians, I argue that there are important elements of their thought that are compatible with what I would consider to be a postmodern political stance. But I want to say something else. Not only are these ideas compatible with Foucault's, I believe the different sets of ideas can enrich each other. In effect, what I'm suggesting in this book is that these ideas should have, if you pardon the phrase, rather vigorous sex. And from this intercourse, they can give birth to a new form of political economic analysis, what I call a postmodern or Foucauldian liberalism that uses Foucault's critical social theory to unmask various forms of illiberalism or over-government in contemporary societies. Now, why is this project important, or why do I think it's important? Well, predominantly speaking, this book is an academic book. It is a fairly technical book in some ways. But it is also a book that has a political edge. Liberalism, in my view, is in crisis. It's challenged on the left by some thinkers influenced by Foucault, who see its freedoms as a sham. And it's challenged on the right by those who blame thinkers like Foucault for the spread of a divisive identity politics. Politically, therefore, the book is meant to be transgressive because it suggests that Foucault's ideas are compatible with a form of liberalism and that those who claim to be liberals should embrace Foucault. In effect, they should do what I've almost done, which is almost fall in love with Foucault. Now, one thing I want to be clear about is a debate that I'm not contributing to in this book. So, in recent years, there's been a stream of controversy in some circles about what Foucault's political commitments came to be, especially at the end of his career. And they were prompted by the series of lectures he gave in 78, 79, published as The Birth of Biopolitics. And in those lectures, Foucault gives what many people consider to be a remarkably sympathetic treatment of a number of thinkers in the liberal tradition, such as Friedrich Hayek, also members of the Chicago School of Economics, such as Gary Becker, to the point where some people have argued that actually Foucault had been converted to these neoliberal ideas. Now, that is the core thesis of the book, which is in the second image there, The Last Man Takes LSD, Foucault and the End of Revolution, by Mitchell Dean and Daniel Zamora. They argue that Foucault had a kind of conversion or intellectual crisis in the mid-1970s that led him towards increasingly liberal themes. This particular image on that book is taken at Zabriskie Point in Death Valley. And they suggest that, having been tripping on LSD the previous day, he sort of looked over this vista and opened his horizon to a new set of intellectual concepts. Now, this kind of idea actually is not all that new. In 1994, this book, written by Lois McNay, suggested that the late Foucault's ideas amounted to an endorsement of what she calls an unregulated libertarianism. Now, I'm not trying to contribute to this debate, to the debate about whether Foucault became a neoliberal or a liberal of any kind, for that matter. What I'm trying to do is look through the corpus of his ideas to see whether there are elements within them that are compatible with a liberal political project. That is my project in this book. So the book is divided into two halves. The first half sets out what I call the elements of a Foucauldian liberalism, showing how these different traditions of thought can be brought together. And then in the second part of the book, I use these ideas to offer a critical deconstruction of what I call discourse cartels, or what Foucault would refer to as dispositifs, that threaten the scope for individuals to exercise their creative capacities, their agency. So what I'm going to do in this presentation, it's a big book, is just sketch the arguments that are in the two halves of the book. So it should take me about 30 minutes, I think, to get through this. So the first element where I think there is agreement between what I call the Foucauldian tradition and what I call the postmodern liberal political economy tradition is their conception of what Foucault calls the subject or the individual. So Foucault is famous for pronouncing on what he calls the death of the subject. Now, what does he mean by the death of the subject? He argues that apart from perhaps some very thin biological parameters, there is no underlying human nature or essence or true rationality. What we think we are, how we relate to others, and what we think is rational cannot be separated from the discourses, conceptual frames, or the regimes of truth that circulate in society and that exercise power over us. What we think we are, to a large extent, is an effect of this discourse power, a form of downward causation acting on the subject, acting on the individual. Now, crucially for Foucault, this discourse power has no author. It is a decentered power that emerges from the interaction of multiple wills to power as different individual agents attempt to conduct the conduct of other individuals in their environment. Though it emerges from individual acts, this power is not possessed by individuals or groups. It flows through people in a series of communicative circuits, relays, or networks. Those subjects are produced, and this is the term that Foucault uses, they are produced by this discourse power. They are not determined by it. They can exercise agency by engaging in forms of resistance, which can morph their conceptions of themselves and the world around them into something new. So crucially for Foucault, there is no freedom or agency outside of discourse. Freedom requires that discourse is a subject of contestation and resistance, so that the understandings and relationships it creates between people can be continually destabilized. Unfreedom, on Foucault's account, arises through relationships between what he calls discursive practices and non-discursive practices that close the space for resistance and challenge, in effect through the creation of discursive monopolies, or what he calls dispositives. Now, there are many similarities between this conception of the subject and the kind of conception of the individual that is put forward by thinkers in what I call the postmodern liberal tradition. And they would include people like Michael Oakeshott, Friedrich Hayek, and a number of other thinkers. So what do these thinkers argue about the character of individuals? Well, the first is they suggest that preferences are endogenous. They are shaped by multiple streams of tradition. So apart from basic desire for food, shelter, and sex, there is no underlying human nature, essence, or rationality. The preferences, values, and dispositions that people have are the product of multiple streams of tradition that people are born into and which emerge from a decentered process of imitative learning. Even in the economic realm, there is no rationality separate from the entanglements that are generated between markets, politics, and tradition. What we think of as rationality is produced by these entanglements. It does not pre-exist them. This means that there is no universal homo economicus. On this kind of a view, the streams of tradition that produce our sense of self and rationality and other ordering institutions such as markets have no author. They are emergent properties from the interaction of multiple individual agents. Or as Hayek often puts it, they are the result of human action, but not of human design. Agents are produced by traditions, working practices, and market structures, not of their own making. But they are not determined by them. They have scope to engage in acts of, if you like, entrepreneurial resistance to the status quo, to fashion something new or different. So what I'm suggesting here is that Foucault and the postmodern liberals agree on what I would call a culturally situated view of the individual. That people are subject to a form of downward causation from culture, but they also, through acts of resistance and entrepreneurship, can engage in agency, which feeds back into that culture, which keeps it or gives it some kind of fluidity. Now, I argue in the book that people in the Foucauldian tradition under-theorize the role of states in this process. And especially, they under-theorize the role of states in fostering what I call cultural or discursive monopolies. The postmodern liberal account suggests that systems of fractured political and economic authority make it more difficult for any one discourse cartel or set of discourses to dominate an entire society. On the other hand, I argue that postmodern liberals can learn a great deal from Foucault by recognizing the role that discourse has in shaping their capacities for agency. The way people are described in language or discourse can influence the extent to which people are willing, in a sense, to exercise their creative powers as individuals. The second element of what Robin called the fusion between these traditions takes place in the understanding of the relationship between science and systems of social control. Foucault and the postmodern liberals, I argue, share a social constructionist critique of modernism and positivism in the human and social sciences. social scientific modernism posits the existence of law-like relationships in human behavior, either at the individual or at the societal level. This modernism empowers various experts to engage in measures designed to manipulate these laws to produce desired outcomes. Now, what I suggest in the book is that both Foucault and the postmodern liberals are concerned with what they would see as the obsession of these traditions with a kind of stable form of social order. Now, if you go back to Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, he makes a very famous distinction between Dionysian characters and Apollonian characters, Dionysus and Apollo being the sons of Zeus. Dionysian characters are characters who have a kind of dreaming and rebellious spirit that constantly want to challenge the status quo. They engage in, if you like, dangerous acts that are always on the edge, or they engage in what Foucault would understand to be limit experiences. Apollonian characters, on the other hand, are concerned with maintaining orderly social patterns, maintaining a fixed set, if you like, of established routines or practices. Now, Nietzsche doesn't think that we should favor one or the other of these, but what many postmodernists, and I'm suggesting Foucault and the postmodern liberals are concerned about, is an excessive focus on the production of social order, rather than on the role of destabilizing dynamics. Now, in Foucault's case, he understands the human and social sciences as forms of what he calls power knowledge, where scientific claims reflect a will to power by certain actors who are attempting to exert positionality over others by claiming to know them and attempting to mold their conduct through the application of various technologies. And he identifies two sorts of this discourse and the kind of technologies that go with it. What Foucault calls disciplinary power targets deviant or disorderly individuals who, through the use of various techniques of observation and surveillance, can be brought into line with what is deemed to be some kind of appropriate conduct. Through observation and surveillance, the suggestion is, it's possible to know the soul of the criminal, the homosexual, and the insane. And through that surveillance, it is possible to manipulate the behaviors of these actors so that they come into line with what is considered to be appropriate forms of conduct. Or at least, through the effect of knowing that you're under surveillance, that you adopt some form of self-control that keeps you in line with these kinds of ideas. In distinction to disciplinary power, which targets deviant individuals, what Foucault calls biopower targets the entire population. It is a modernist incarnation of the pastoral power that used to be exercised over the population by the medieval church. The medieval church claiming to be able to guide society onto the right path. This power works by identifying multiple pattern anomalies or societal disequilibria relating to economic growth, inequality, or demography, which require some form of corrective treatment. Typically, this kind of power governs through statistics, which claim to know societal phenomena and to manipulate them so as to secure the welfare of the population or subgroups within the population. It often governs at a distance, not through direct commands, but through target setting, auditing and reporting rules, performance management indicators, taxes, subsidies, or contracts tied to the production of data. Now, in Foucault's view, very often, these kinds of techniques don't actually work, even on their own terms. And the reason for that is that they are based on what he would claim are highly perspectival truth claims. They reflect the subjectivity of the agent who's projecting something onto those who are subjected to these kinds of scientific gaze, if you like. But crucially for Foucault, even if these techniques don't work as they're supposed to do, they can exercise significant power effects on those who are subject to them. So knowing that you're under surveillance, knowing that you are labeled in a certain way, can be internalized by the individual and affect the way in which they behave. It can leave them stuck in classificatory categories rather than enabling them to break out of these sorts of categories. Many similarities between this kind of a view and the critique of what's often called scientism that is put forward by the people I call postmodern liberals. And I think Friedrich Hayek is the best example of this kind of argument. In Hayek's view, neither individuals nor human societies are scientifically legible or knowable objects. They are examples of what Hayek calls complex phenomena, where both the number of relevant variables and the character of their interaction is too vast to be subject to some kind of God's eye perspective. Now, in his view, it's not simply, however, that there are too many variables to be observed, but that human creativity injects non-linearity into the way that people are produced by or will respond to any given set of background conditions. In other words, there are no stable variables. There are no stable variables. So at the level of the individual, the character of the nature-nurture dynamic and its interaction with creative agency is too complex to be known through scientific or positivistic techniques. At the societal level, the interactions between multiple individuals produce outcomes that cannot be statistically known by social planners. Statistics often misrecognize the phenomena they claim to know. And if they're used as the basis for planning and regulation, they will often subjugate the localized, subjective, and tacit knowledge of millions of actors in markets and civil society. This applies not only to, if you like, full-blown socialist or communist regimes. It also applies, though perhaps to a lesser extent, to milder forms of this government by statistics, of the type that we see, for example, in claims by various economists, whether they are Keynesians or monetarists, to be able to manipulate macroeconomic aggregates to produce desired economic outcomes. On the postmodern liberal view, socioeconomic planning threatens freedom and agency because it replaces the competing truth claims, if you like, the power knowledge claims of multiple entrepreneurs and jurisdictions with the imposition of a classificatory grid that designates plan conforming and plan deviant behaviors. Now, in terms of the conversation between these perspectives, I believe that liberals, or the people I'm calling the postmodern liberals, can help give, if you like, a scientific or a type of scientific underpinning to the kinds of claims that Foucault makes. Foucault is often subject to the charge that he's making his own power knowledge claims. Why should we believe Foucault's own conception of how society operates, of his own theory of power? I think that the postmodern liberals can provide a kind of answer to that, which is to turn to the non-positivistic sciences of complexity or nonlinearity. These are scientific understandings of the world which do not claim some kind of predictive power. They're forms of scientific understanding that understand, for example, phenomena like evolution by natural selection that are not predictive. They tell a kind of story or narrative of how certain processes operate, like evolution by natural selection, but they do not claim to be able to test it in some positivistic sense. All they claim to offer is a plausibility of a narrative in comparison to some other narrative. For example, compare the plausibility of evolution by natural selection to some notion of intelligent design. That will be the kind of comparison that would be involved here. Now, I think Foucault needs this kind of an account to defend, for example, his own theory of power. This notion that power is decentralized, it's dispersed, it has multiple kinds of effects, needs a justification. And it provides, in my view, a plausible narrative for why we can't do what many other traditions in political economy have done, such as the Marxist tradition, but also the rational choice tradition, which is to reduce power to the control of economic resources, or to look at the structure of formal or hard institutions and rules. Foucault, I think, though, can also help the people that I call the postmodern liberals by looking at the effect that these various discourses have on their capacities for agency. What does it do to people and their sense of their capacity to act when we have distinctions between those who are the planners and the planned, those who are the regulated and those who are the regulators and the regulated, those who are the stimulators and the stimulated, those who are the nudgers and the nudged? The third element of the fusion is to look at the relationship between freedom and rights in the Foucauldian and the postmodern liberal traditions. Foucault and the postmodern liberals, I argue, share the view that there is no freedom outside of power, discourse, and tradition. There's no true or authentic self waiting to be liberated from the effects of power. Freedom is the capacity to play with, to challenge and to recombine the cultural categories in which we're all situated. It is a process of self-creation in the face of power. But different constructions of rights and freedom are not neutral in what Foucault would call their power effects on the kinds of subjects they produce and the extent to which they enlarge or close down the space for subjects to recreate themselves. So in what sense are, as Foucault would understand it, rights not neutral? Well, Foucault claims, and many people who I would call left Foucauldians make the following claim. If we focus on negative rights, in the way that classical liberals have often done, rights to non-interference, freedom of contract, protection of the body, protection of the person, this ignores all of the decentered forms of interference that people face in their lives from the cultural environment. Those that treat gay people in a certain way, or women, or people of various ethnic groups that are not actually necessarily represented in the formal structures. So people coming from this kind of tradition might say, what is the point of these formal rights if in the realm of civil society and the economy, you are subject to multiple forms of potentially oppressive relationships? Now, that is certainly a point that Foucault, I think, does make, or many people in that tradition make. But they're also, crucially, very skeptical of positive rights theories. Theories of rights which equate freedom with access to a particular level of resources or to a particular level of cultural status. Why is that? Well, for a couple of reasons. If you speak about people as being unfree because they lack resources or they lack cultural status, and you institutionalize that discourse, you could produce the object of which you speak. You could produce what Foucault would call docile bodies, who do not believe they have any agency to create opportunities, wealth, or to change their status in society through acts of their own agency. So that's the first point. The second point is that positive rights tend to equate freedom with the achievement of certain patterns. There must be a certain pattern of resource distribution or a certain pattern of cultural status if people are to be free. But the problem is, to maintain patterns, you require a surveillance apparatus to make sure that people aren't acting in ways which disrupt the pattern. This goes back into the previous point about the Dionysian and the Apollonian. If we have disruptive actors, well, they're going to be continually upsetting patterns. So what are you going to do to keep the pattern? You're going to have to introduce disciplinary power. you're going to have to introduce surveillance mechanisms right across civil society, the market economy, and other kinds of structures to make sure that people are molded in ways that keep them into a particular kind of pattern. This is what Foucault calls a normalizing society, where every aspect of what you do is subject to these kinds of surveillance techniques. Now, I think there are many commonalities between this kind of account and the kind of points that people that I would call postmodern liberals would make. The key argument that many people in this tradition would make is the one that's actually often associated with Robert Nozick, who I don't include in this tradition, but it's implicit in many of the arguments that are made by people in this tradition. It's the idea that liberty upsets patterns. If people have agency, then whatever resources you give them, whatever cultural status you give them, they will continually act in ways that disrupt or destabilize the pattern that you want to keep in place. Okay, so liberty upsets patterns. Now, this tradition would also emphasize that positive rights cannot be separated from the notion of pattern control. They cannot be separated from a kind of demand to create a surveillance apparatus that keeps people into particular patterns of behavior. They turn society, or they turn the state rather, into what Tocqueville calls an immense tutelary power, which is intervening in every area of life in the interests of what we might call pattern control. Now, in this kind of a view, and I think this is a view that actually Foucault himself moves towards, at the end of his life, there is actually a strong case for negative rights. Okay, the negative rights which are just rights to non-interference with person and property. Why? Because those rights give people the space to find their own ways of challenging the power relations in which they are embedded. They do not require that people have some external liberator or surveillance mechanism which is required to equalize people before they can be free. The problem with positive rights conceptions on this kind of a view is precisely that it requires a whole paternalistic apparatus of surveillance which actually limits people's scope to be creative agents. So this is the way I think these traditions can be combined when we look at the question of freedom and rights. Now, that doesn't mean that there should be no positive rights, okay? So I think, for example, and I make this argument in the book, you can make an argument for something like a basic income. You could also make an argument for basic anti-discrimination law. But what you wouldn't want to do, if you're following this kind of analysis, is to have an obsessive focus on patterns and data monitoring across multiple areas, because it requires a form of surveillance that crushes the space for individual freedom, for individual creative agency, for people to break out of the categories that the data gatherers, if you like, are putting them into. So that's the synthesis of the key arguments in the first part of the book. In the second part of the book, I offer what I'd call a critical deconstruction of what I consider to be the ruling narratives, or as Foucault would call it, dispositives in today's society. Now, these dispositives, or what we might call discourse cartels, they don't come from any one source. So I'm not claiming that there is a single discourse, if you like, that governs contemporary societies. What we have is a coalition of different discourses which overlap in various ways, but which produce, in the Foucauldian sense, what I think are very similar power effects. Now, what are the defining categories of these ruling narratives? Well, they are what Foucault would call biopolitical discourses. They're concerned with the monitoring and correction of various pattern anomalies. And they are concerned with those pattern anomalies because they believe that societies are knowable and manageable objects. The assumption that underlies all of these discourses is that society can be known, it is legible, and because it's legible, it can be controlled. through some form of surveillance apparatus. Even if these discourses don't actually work, even if they don't deliver the kind of control that they think they're offering, they have multiple power effects which actually close the space for individuals to be free and creative actors. How do they do that? Well, there are two ways that I think these biopolitical regimes crush the space for individual freedom. The first is that they gradually, almost imperceptibly, erase the individual as a focus of concern in the social order, precisely because they are focused on patterns, because they target population-level variables or aggregates. What matters in biopolitical regimes are abstract commitments to social objectives, the welfare of the population, to the community or subgroups within it, and more broadly, to multiple targets which are attached to these signifiers. Insofar as freedom is referenced at all in these discourses, it's equated with the removal of various pattern anomalies, considered as some kind of evidence of inefficiency or injustice. Individual freedom and evaluational pluralism are disappeared in the name of pattern control. A number of examples that I think we might sort of take for granted to not realize that this is happening. Take macroeconomics, growth targeting. The idea that there should be a rate of economic growth that is a target for policy is taken for granted in most contemporary liberal societies. But why on earth do we need growth targeting? Different people may have different preferences for whether they want to invest for the future, whether they want to spend today, what leisure time they want to have, whatever. Why do we need to have growth targeting? Well, growth targeting empowers various people. It empowers lots of economists. It empowers lots of consultants, lots of people. But why do we need it? Okay, do we want more growth, degrowth, a middle amount of growth? Well, that varies across individuals. But that variety is erased by these discourses that focus on the right societal level of economic growth. Take public health as an example. Think about smoking. We know that smoking is a form of pollution, okay? But we could approach the question of smoking in public places as one of, if you like, dispute resolution between actors who have different preferences. Some people are willing to take the risk of smoking themselves and also being in places where other people are smoking. Other people don't want to take those risks. They want, if you like, the safety of not having smoke in the air. We could look at that as a potentially kind of opportunity for what economists would call Coasian bargaining between these different positions. But that's not what we see in all the public health narratives. It's all about the target level of smoking in the population. Okay? And not only smoking, of course, now, vaping, multiple other kinds of activity, which is that there's going to be a target to which the rules and regulations are going to be directed. In all of these, the individual preference of actors is erased from view. The individual is effectively disappeared by this kind of narrative or discourse. Think about social justice and the area of equality, diversity, and inclusion. In these narratives, the experience of the individual isn't really what matters. How individuals fit or can be fitted into classificatory schemes and wielded for managerial purposes is what counts in this kind of dispositif. The actual experience of a specific person who happens to be gay, female, or black isn't what matters. What counts is their status as part of a manageable category. Internal diversity within these categories or groupings is effectively erased from view. And that in itself has power effects. Instead of having people transgressing boundaries, creating new identities which bust open these categories, instead people are fixed within them in ways that limit creativity and the possibility that new identity figurations could actually be created. We see a similar process in the area of sustainable development or environmental social governance. In these discourses, it's not the environment that any individual inhabits that matters, but the attainment of abstract targets and goals that have become attached to or associated with the label of sustainable development. The next area, or next mechanism through which freedom is eliminated or crushed in these discourses, is through what I call the policing of truth. Biopolitical regimes, or these biopolitical narratives, provide, if you like, strategic logics which generate a pattern of incentives for agents to close the space for pluralism, to close the space for open discussion and critique. Though their power is facilitated by legislative authority, they govern at a distance, stimulating a decentralized surveillance network by installing pieces of managerial code into multiple branches of the public sector, but also the private sector and civil society in organizations and charities. They do so by introducing reporting and auditing schemes, contracting arrangements, performance management indicators, where actors can secure access to rewards, contracts, and positions by publicly demonstrating their commitment to abstract targets and goals. This is why Britain and many other countries, and in many other countries, there has been an explosion in what we might call the compliance class, epitomized in many of the kind of quangocratic agencies around, for example, the Bank of England, the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, and many other societies. Now, in this kind of field, it depends on who the actors are who police the truth. In some situations, it's experts or scientists. In others, it's those who are identified as so-called stakeholders. But in each of these cases, there are incentives for the agents concerned to narrow the range of acceptable opinion, to close down pluralism. Why is that the case? In the case of scientific experts, okay, if you're going to maintain your position in society as an expert, your positionality as an expert, you don't want there to be too many other sources of expertise. Because the more challenges there are, the more experts there are with a diversity of opinions, the more likely it is people will lose faith in that expertise, or might actually want to select their own expert rather than having the expert chosen for them. So there are incentives in these fields to close down the range of acceptable opinion. Likewise, if you're claiming to represent a stakeholder group, you don't want there to be too much disagreement within the stakeholders about what that group might actually want or represent. Because if you do, the integrity of the group, if you like, and the power structure that goes with it might actually be undermined. So in both of these settings, there are dynamics that tend to lead to a closing of opinion. And I want to give a few examples to illustrate that. Let's take public health as again as an example. Think about the pandemic. In the pandemic, there were multiple opinions, actually amongst the scientists, about what should be the appropriate response. But that multiplicity was closed down by a form of, if you like, disciplinary power. Okay, so people aligned on a certain view, and then those who dissented from that view were very quickly marginalized through the discourse and through various techniques to manage their conduct. This also happens if you think about the advice about the foods we should eat, or various other forms of behaviors that we should be adopting. The range of opinion, even if it's pluralistic amongst the science, quickly gets closed down to accepted views, and then other views are quickly marginalized. We see this in social justice narratives, where particular stakeholders claim to represent entire groups and then quickly close down the pluralism that might exist within those groups. And we see it also in sustainable development. If I give one example related to the environment, which I think is a very significant one, it relates to the attitude of the environmental movement to proposals for a carbon tax. Now, I think there's a strong argument for having something like a carbon tax to address climate change. Okay? But many people in the environmental movement do not want carbon taxes. Why? Because carbon taxes allow people a great deal of scope to respond to the tax in their own way, to innovate in different ways, to lower the price that they have to pay. There's no particular set of behaviors that are required. It's left to the individual or the company or whatever to adapt to the price signal, even though in this case it's a centrally determined price signal rather than a genuine market price signal. But that's not what many people in the green movement want. They effectively want disciplinary power that specifies the difference between good and bad technologies, the foods that you should eat, how you should live, the shape of your town. All of these things are to be subject to a kind of disciplinary gaze, which makes distinctions between the morally right behaviors and the morally bad behaviors. This is a disciplinary apparatus, not an apparatus which is allowing people to experiment in different ways, in this case in responding to a genuine and real problem. So let me conclude. I'm not saying that none of these issues aren't genuine. I'm not saying there aren't public health challenges. I'm not saying there aren't social justice challenges. I'm not saying there aren't environmental challenges. What I'm problematizing is the conceptual lens through which these problems are viewed. Okay, it's the idea that society is a knowable and manageable object, and that through, if you like, various policing mechanisms, we can produce better outcomes. That is the narrative or the discourse that I want to challenge in my book. So is there any hope of resistance against this dispositif or these set of dispositifs? Well, I'm afraid at the moment I'm rather pessimistic about that. The populist charge in the United States and its equivalents in Europe is not being driven by the belief in the self-creating and self-governing powers of peoples, but in the belief that the wrong set of experts or the wrong set of pastors have been in charge, and the demand for a new saviour who can set them onto a better path. It is basically substituting one form of social control for another. If the logics of what I call the biopolitical state are to be challenged, what is needed is the embrace of new narratives or discourses that challenge the idea of society as a unity, as a manageable or controllable object, and that value pluralism and diversity, not just between groups, but within groups, and that affirm the capacity of people to govern themselves. These are the narratives of a postmodern liberalism. These are the narratives that I advance in this book. Thank you very much for listening, for coming this evening. It's a really important question. So I should be clear, I don't think there's anything wrong with DEI initiatives themselves. Okay, what is a problem is when they become lined up as a requirement for people to follow, if you like, in every aspect of their lives. That's the problem. I mean, I probably shouldn't say this because King's is my employer, but at King's we are encouraged to incorporate DEI, and I quote, in all that we do. That is the danger, okay? So it's not that DEI itself is a problem. DEI could be a good strategy for being more inclusive. But the problem is when you line it up with a centralized apparatus, which is basically stimulating these police or surveillance networks in other areas. So how do we respond to that? It's very difficult. I think it requires entrepreneurial resistance by brave agents, people who are willing to actually break out of those categories. So I have no problem, for example, with ideas around intersectionality. The problem is that it's not diverse enough. We need people to cross boundaries, like form coalitions between unexpected parties so that new identities can be created. And that is only going to happen from the bottom up, through lots of agents trying to figure out themselves, how do I negotiate this apparatus? How do I resist it? How do I evade it? And how can something new come from those acts of resistance? What you shouldn't do is, I think, what is happening in the United States, which is the state is being used as the instrument, if you like, to try to get rid of these things. And what you're having is one surveillance network being replaced by another. It's a great question. So my answer to that is what you want in, if you like, the general population is an attitude of radical skepticism. So skepticism of the truth claims that are made by corporations, of the claims that are made by state agencies, and what you want is a maximum level of contestation. The problem is when you set up the idea that there is an expertise or a truth, that is what creates the logics that then close down this space. Because that claim to truth is giving people power that, in my view, nobody really should have. Now, how you get to a more plural space when you've got a regime which is influenced by material interests, but it's not only material interests, sometimes it's just the desire of people to exercise power and control over other people. It's actually really difficult. All I can say is you want maximization of challenge. Okay, so yes, you want people exposing that certain corporations might be funding certain lobby groups, but you equally need to be aware that the state often funds lobby groups that lobby for more state regulation. So this is a very difficult area to negotiate. I don't have any easy answers to it. No, it's a great question. I mean, what you're getting at is actually a fundamental point in Foucault that people often forget, which is the idea that power is productive. Okay, it's not necessarily negative. And the classic example he gives is of homosexuality. The construction of homosexuality in a certain way enabled people who were gay people to actually find each other, to actually find a kind of movement, to do something about the way that they were treated in society. What he's concerned about, though, is the idea that you get frozen into a category. So, like, what does it mean to be a gay person? What does it mean to have PTSD? What does it mean to have these other sorts of things? And that is a very difficult area. And it actually goes back to the previous question in a way where you need a kind of radical skepticism sort of constantly there, which in some ways can be quite exhausting if you're always having to think, well, am I sort of stuck in a category that I should be challenging? Well, which one do I challenge? It's not easy. And I think, again, I didn't mention this in the talk because I didn't have time, but this is an area where there's actually commonality between what I think is a defensible Foucauldian position and the kind of view that certain liberals would make. So people like Oakeshott or Hayek would say, you can challenge certain aspects of the society, but what you can't be doing is challenging everything all at once. Okay, because if, as Foucault says, you want people to be able to lead their lives as a work of art, not being stuck in rigid categories, but painting new sort of shapes or forms. Well, you can't sort of do that every day anew. To make your life a work of art, it can't be changing every single day. There's got to be some level of stability. So you've got to pick the things that you are engaging in this sort of challenge and contestation about. But I think all you can do is try to maintain a regime of generalized skepticism. And it's exactly that skepticism that I think is threatened by the kind of processes that I was talking about in the presentation. Well, I agree with you. So this is one of the areas where I think there are flaws in, if you like, many people in the Hayekian tradition. Now, there are actually people, I think, who are starting to remedy this problem. So I'm a big fan of Richard Wagner's work. He has a book from 2016 called Entangled Political Economy. And his whole notion there is that what Hayek calls spontaneous order is not just markets. It's actually about the complex entanglements between markets and states. So in a sense, I don't have a problem with it when people say there's no such thing as a free market as distinct from the thing called the state, that they're always intertwined. what you want to be looking at, I think, if you are using the kind of perspective I'm trying to articulate, is how discourses affect the character of those entanglements. Do those entanglements operate in a way that keeps a kind of fluid space, keeps things moving, where they're open to kind of destabilization? Or the term I use in the book is Schumpeterian creative destruction, which is the kind of Dionysian element. Or do they work in such a way that this kind of space for agency or pluralism is closed down? And what I'm trying to say is that these kind of processes at the moment are operating in ways. You've got a particular interaction between state, market, and discourse, which is closing down the space for pluralism. Now, there are other ways in which that can happen. So I'd be very sympathetic to the arguments that, in the 1980s, when you had organizations like the World Bank, they were exercising a kind of disciplinary power in telling people to have markets. So I don't want to have a narrative which says you must have markets. But you shouldn't be prevented from having them either. We shouldn't prevent markets from emerging. And some of these discourses do want to prevent them from emerging, or they want to control them in very, very constraining ways. That's what I'd be concerned about. But the state-market dichotomy idea, which is still prevalent in a lot of classical liberal thinking, I think must go. It's a weakness of that tradition, and I hope what I'm saying is not guilty of it. Okay, so what I'm saying is not saying you shouldn't have numbers. I'm not saying you shouldn't have numbers, but you should be very wary of the effects that numbers can have. We've got to have a skepticism about them. So statistics do not necessarily represent reality. I mean, one of the Austrian school thinkers are very critical of statistics as distinct from prices. So prices are numbers, but prices are numbers that emerge from the interaction of subjects, bargaining, negotiating, etc. with each other. They're not imposed from outside by someone putting a grid upon the society and trying to regulate it in that way. Now, because you can't have markets in all areas and you can't have prices for everything, maybe you have to use statistics. And maybe in a pandemic, you have to use statistics. But you need to be aware that those statistics do not necessarily represent reality. At the best, they're a kind of sophisticated guesswork. And the problem is the aura of science that is associated with these kind of numbers. And this is not just true in public health, it's true in macroeconomics. The whole of macroeconomics is based on, what I would say are often just statistical illusions. Well, I do. So my argument is that there is an effect. If we can say, Foucault says essentially there's no human nature. But if there is a human nature, it's this determination to exert a will to power. Okay, so the attempt to influence others. So we are all social beings, and as social beings, we attempt to conduct the conduct of other actors. And what is significant is that happens in multiple ways. And that is consistent with multiple kinds of subjects being produced. So there's no requirement in the kind of view that I'm putting forward that you just celebrate a form of individualism. Okay, now that would be an important element. Individuals must be able to, if you like, live an individualistic life. But there's nothing wrong with having communal acts of resistance against what people perceive to be excessive individualism. You don't want either a kind of collectivist ethos or an ultra-individual ethos, individualist ethos, governing the whole of society. You want there to be spaces or cracks where different conceptions of the subject, more or less collectivistic ones, can kind of coexist. That is a kind of pluralistic ideal. So I'm not saying we want an ultra-individualized kind of view, because the whole approach, as I hope I tried to say, is that people are always social. They're always embedded in norms, practices, traditions, some of which will be communalistic. But the role of agency is the fact that individuals can play with these traditions in different ways. Okay, that's the entrepreneurial aspect of what Foucault calls resistance, that you can play around with these categories and something new can come from them. So that's what I'm trying to defend. Now, the governing at a distance point, I think, is an interesting one, because what I would suggest is that no complex society, and this is a kind of Hayekian point actually, can be governed directly. Okay, so his whole point is that even so-called centrally planned systems actually governed at a distance. If you look at the way the Soviet system functioned or the way that China functions today, it is not literally controlled from the center. There's all kinds of quasi-market relationships operating. Or there might be target setting, but then people are given space to respond to targets. So the reason you have to govern at a distance in part is that pure top-down control simply is not operable, at least not in a moderately sophisticated society. So you've got to look for different management techniques that are going to be able to control people or manipulate them, given that you can't do it in a purely top-down manner. So yes, I hope that answers the question. Okay, there's a lot in that question. So I didn't mention it in the presentation, but I do have a chapter actually on law and order, and I have a section on counter-terrorism in that, thinking about what this perspective implies for dealing with terrorism. One of the things I argue in the book actually is that a lot of counter-terrorism strategies are based on a positivist model. The idea that you can know the terrorists, you know what strategies they will use, and actually the problem is in many cases, terrorists are entrepreneurial actors. They often act in unpredictable ways. So the techniques you use at one point in time won't actually be well adapted to what is going to be the next sort of terrorist threat. It's a kind of implication of this kind of Austrian or Hayekian conception of the individual as a creative actor and what that implies for things like terrorism. Now, your point about biopolitics not just being in Western societies or the UK or wherever, the models that I've got in mind, is absolutely taken. And I think one of the great things about Foucault's project is the idea that power is mobile. It moves across different sort of dimensions. It's picked up from different places, reinterpreted. So certain techniques that might be applied in certain countries can be adapted or repurposed in other sorts of places. And you can never actually completely tell where they came from, whether they had an original author or origin. All these kinds of techniques and management strategies are constantly evolving, morphing as they interact with other sorts of techniques and practices. I would certainly claim that, and this is one of my worries that is kind of implicit in this, is that something like, and I don't know enough about China, for example, to be able to say whether this is accurate or not, but something like a model of a social credit regime is a Foucauldian nightmare, because it is about linking everybody up in all of their practices to multiple scoring, ranking, grading, and classificatory systems. So if there is a social credit regime that operates in China, it'd be one I'd be very, very skeptical of, and this kind of analysis would apply to. What is disturbing is that some of the actors that populate what I'm calling the biopolitical state in, say, Western Europe and Britain and the United States are actually admirers of that kind of social credit regime. And I think we should be very, very wary of it. Your final point, which was about can we avoid co-optation? I mean, that's very, very challenging. What I think you need to do, and this is what I hope I tried to hint at in the final part of the talk, is, and I think it's a mistake that liberals, classical liberals like me have made in the past, is to focus on the state. Okay, they often make the same mistake that the Marxists make or have made in the past, which is if only you can grasp the state apparatus and control that, somehow all these other things will disappear. Well, no, if you take this view that power is decentralized, that isn't going to be the appropriate strategy. So you need multiple locations within civil society and the economy where people are willing to revolt. That's all I can say. Well, so what I'm trying to say is that if the liberalism I defend has a conception of human nature, it's a very thin one, okay? So it doesn't deny, for example, that there are things like sex differences, okay? it would say that nothing really follows from that. Okay, so the fact that there are differences between men and women in some scientific sense doesn't say anything about what it means to be a man, how you comport yourself as a man, what you call yourself as a man. It doesn't mean anything about those things. What you want is a kind of fluidity within all of these categories so that they can be continually mixed up and challenged, okay, so that people are crossing boundaries. And the problem I have with some DEI schemes, not necessarily all of them, is that they're actually reproducing the categories. They're fixing people into certain kinds of categories. So in certain of these narratives, gays and lesbians are presented as weak people who need protection. Women are presented in that way. Well, no, like many of the female liberation movements or gay liberation movements wanted a much more positive understanding of people as people who've got agency, people who can do things themselves and don't require some external liberator to free them. And I think a great example of that is, if you look at the women's movement in Iran, women have been revolting, even in the most inauspicious circumstances, where they're subject to massive forms of surveillance, control, and the power of the state. And sadly, from my point of view, the power of the state has won out in that case through the violence that's been used. But the very fact that those women were able to exercise agency and challenge the status quo in such a regime is encouraging.
Sorry, I myself, I'm from Iran.
Oh.
And I know it's a really hard situation.
But the reason I made that point is that I think the danger is in some of these categories that you're actually reproducing narratives around people that are part of the problem in the first place. I do agree with you. I think we would want to avoid them. I think the argument that I'm putting forward, I feel, is most compelling when you're looking at social science and human science. So, and I think the environmental example is an interesting one on that. So, you can take it as if you like, given, and I do in my argument, that there is such a thing as climate change. So, you could even have quite a draconian view on that and say, we're just not listening to people who deny the natural science as it's understood, although I think there should be pluralism in that as well. But say you take that, it doesn't tell you anything about the response that there should be to climate change. So whether you're going to have carbon taxes, whether you're going to have some other kind of strategy is a social scientific question. And that is the area where I think many of these kind of issues come into play. And I hope it's clear that I am very skeptical of social scientific expertise in many areas. The fact that there are replication crises in multiple social science fields is indicative of that. But I also think it is, and this is the point I was trying to make about sciences of complex phenomena, it's not about being anti-scientific. It's about having the appropriate understanding of what science might achieve given the kind of phenomena it's actually looking at. So I would hope that will be the space that the conversation can take place. And that's the way to get the balance. But I don't know whether that fully answers the question. I'm not arguing that you just have to decentralize things. I'm not arguing that. I think decentralization, or what I would call fractured political authority, makes it harder for any one set of narratives to become kind of monopolistic. So you can think of Foucault talking about a kind of cultural variant of wanting to avoid cartels in markets or monopolistic market structures. You can think of it almost being a cultural variant of that. So some attempt to keep political authority fractured, I think, is part of that. But if you have a situation where these kind of narratives are already in place, then just decentralizing isn't going to alter that, because the decentralized agency is going to just introduce the same kind of techniques or models. So you have to have something that is challenging this discourse in the first place, these discourses of what I would call control. And there's no way of getting away from that. And the kind of perspective I'm putting forward is very vague, necessarily so, about how those challenges come about. I'd have to challenge you on the last point, because I think there are many examples of centralized authorities which do get themselves into debt. What I would say is you've got to be very careful about having a narrative which says certain agencies, if you leave them on their own, they'll do terrible things. Because then you are reproducing a very paternalistic narrative. This is exactly the argument that a lot of colonial authorities used to use about not allowing people to have independence. We can't allow people to be free because they haven't learned yet the right ways to be free. No, is what you say to that, or at least I do. Sorry.
I think everyone has had a question that originally put their hands up. So while I'm wary in this context of bringing discussion to a close, I think it would be prudent to move and continue a discussion over drinks, but not before we've thanked Mark again for an excellent talk.